But my name is Jacob Redding. Um, I'm as was just mentioned, I'm teaching the upcoming micro course on workflows and infrastructure, as well as the production of decentralized and distributed software. My background is I am a network and system administrator and a technical architect, but I mainly run software development teams. Um, and currently, my role professionally is I work for Accenture, which is a very large systems integrator and consulting company. We're about 500,000 people worldwide, and I am in a small group of our open source leads globally. And I wear two hats. One, I focus on helping build our own internal open source culture strategy, and getting Accenture as a whole to contribute to open source, create open source projects, and engage in the production of open source software. And on the flip side, I work with our clients to help them create their open source strategy. So oftentimes we'll have like an enterprise company that has been developing software for years, and they're just trying to figure out, well, how do I get my software externally, and how do I get other people interested? Which is often around sort of like industry collaboration. So they're maybe a manufacturing firm, and they're trying to get their other manufacturing firms to collaborate on something that is not part of their core business. Perhaps it's part of the supply chain, perhaps it's sort of like logistics or tracking information. And they've been building the software custom for years, and now they want to sort of collaborate with their competitors on it. And though I do a lot of consulting around that, I do a lot of consulting on the open source strategy, as well as, how do you just get involved in existing projects that are out there? As for my background in open source, I've been a developer. So I mainly write Python and PHP. Those are my two preferred languages. I have a bit of JavaScript as well. And so some of my earlier projects are listed there in the first bullet points. There's an old CMS called Jetbox that I got involved with about, well, almost 20 years ago. And then another one, which is Gallery. It helps maintain image galleries online. There's been a number of JavaScript packages that I contribute to and connect with. Recently, they're generally all part of the data science world, data pipelines and such. But I spent the majority of my time in the Drupal open source project. And I got involved in Drupal in 2000 and I think 2005 or 2006. It's been a long time. So I'm gonna go with 2006. And since that time, 14 years ago, Drupal was just a small open source project, a few people gathering every month just to talk about it. And now we're a little over 35,000 active developers every single year contributing. It's used on a few million different websites out there, and it's one of the largest open source CMSs out there. It runs many federal websites. It runs a lot of enterprise clients. It runs a lot of small to medium businesses, and it's the backend engine to a lot of websites. So it's been an interesting journey to be involved as a developer, because when I got involved with the project, I was simply a developer. I just built a module, collaborated on a few other modules, and put it out there. And then I started getting involved with, wait, we got to get people together. We have to connect people. We've been running these like meetups that would have 10 people, 30 people, then 100 people, then 300 people. Those turned into camps, which turned into conferences. And now we have 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 people showing up at conferences. And we need to, connect these people. And then it, grew from, Western Europe over to the United States, from the United States over to, Eastern Europe, and then into Asia. And now it's sort of worldwide. And we have people in the community from all over the world. So I got involved in leadership of that project, helped to create our nonprofit, the foundation that supports the project, became the first executive director there, and working with the founder, working with our technical steering committees, and working with a really big group of really wonderful people, we grew that project from a handful of developers to tens of thousands of developers, and a foundation from non-existence to now it's about a $5 million annual nonprofit that supports the project to help pay for that infrastructure, that behind the scenes stuff, Drupal.org, the disaster recovery, the repositories, the tooling, the issue queues, the security management system, the bug reporting, the documentation systems, all of those things. And so I'm bringing that experience of working within Drupal and building that project up, as well as working with other projects where I started to take that experience and work with some other projects and bringing that into workflows and infrastructure. So it'll be a little bit of mix of how do we run an open source project from sort of a non-company perspective as a community based, as well as bringing in my experience working with very large companies that have substantial financial resources and marrying these two. Like how do you, if you're a company and you have also corporate restrictions, IT restrictions, how do you do that? And if you're a community that it's basically laissez-faire, like whatever you want to do, but you need to come up with some consensus, how do you bring these things together? So that's what I'll be doing in that course. Um, Today, one of the things that we want to talk about is we want to talk about the governance of a project. And one of the things that I look at when I look at governance is one of the books that I look to and the bodies of research I look to is this book by Nicole Forsgren, Accelerate. So this body of research, so it's a book you can buy. It's also a series of blog posts that are out there. And if you Google these authors down here, really great people to follow. And they look at the metrics behind what gets people together and connected and what accelerates their software development practices. And I always start here because I feel like it plays into the governance of a project to a number of ways. So the first two quotes up here are the ones that I look to for this particular course and this particular talk around governance. So first off, it shows that the research that lean management, along with other technical practice like continued delivery, impact culture, right? Um, and so I think that's important. So it's just saying your technical practices are going to impact your culture. And the second one is that software delivery performance is affected by many factors, blah, 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 and culture is one of them, right? These two together they're demonstrating through metrics and through actual data that your culture, the way you do leadership and the way you pull together your tools are having a direct impact on your the performance of building your software and getting it out there and releasing it and building quality software. They do tend to indicate that your culture is one of the most important pieces there. And that culture, I feel, also plays into how you decide on your governance, because as you build your governance, it will impact your culture and vice versa. Your culture impacts your governance helps create or impact your culture. So I want to talk about this journey of engagement here, and I'm going to bring it back into this talk about governance and culture in about a slide or two. This journey of engagement, I see it as a 4-step process. And when I'm talking about engagement, what I'm talking about is becoming aware of an open source project or a project, then moving from left to right to engaging in that project. So first off, you're just becoming aware. Okay, I know it, maybe I'm using it. Then you participate. So you might submit something in to the project, ask a question, but it's mainly from you to them. The contribution portion, now this is where we're sort of like bringing in some of that governance and that culture is really coming into play. Because when you move into the contribution stage, now you're creating content that's being pushed to the project and vice versa. They're sending you things back and you're starting to get engaged. So maybe you're submitting security requests or bug reports or feature enhancements or architecture suggestions or code improvement suggestions, or just collaborating on the documentation or collaborating on marketing the project. But you're getting a little bit more involved. And then engagement at the very end of that is you're very involved. You might be in a leadership position, you might be directing things, you might have like taken up sort of a um, an a re-architecture role or something of that nature. You're very engaged. And to bring these down into definitions here, I see these as cyclical. So people become aware, they start to participate, then they contribute, then they become engaged, and you just sort of like keep going in this cycle. But awareness and participation are these first two stages of where you're just either getting introduced to the culture or you're building it and creating that culture. So what I mean by that is if I'm advising a company that's getting involved in a project, this awareness and participation stage is very important to that company because they're learning how their internal culture of their company meshes or does not mesh with the external culture of the project. This is the stage where they have to work out those differences. They got to work out how they want to work with this project and how that project wants to work with them. Uh, and it's it's I think it's pretty, I don't want to say vital, it seems very strong, but it's a very important phase to work out those like kinks and those bugs, and to figure out sort of that flow. Because you can't figure out that flow in those phases when you get to contribution, where you're submitting patches for bug fixes or you're asking for feature enhancements, or you really want that project to do something that'll benefit you and your company or you and your project. It's going to be more difficult because you haven't worked out those kinks in the culture. And not working out those kinks in the culture will play right into the governance, which is the point of this conversation. And the governance is where we get into actually getting this stuff through the whole process to get either your feature in, get the bug fixed, etc. So let's talk about a little bit how this like plays into the broader um, model for how to for building your culture, for engaging in a project, or building a project where others engage with you. Now, the topic of this conversation is governance, so it's right here as one of the building blocks towards the top. And I've been using this pyramid for a while to describe what I what I like to think of as like the building blocks to building a culture or the building blocks to building an engagement model for either your open source project, but more it's building your culture for your company to engage externally with an open source project or to collaborate with an open source project. Now, in the course, we go over all of these and things, but this course, this time we have is we're just going to focus on governance. But quickly, I want us to go over the sort of the bottom up because I see it as, and you got to lay down the foundation first and then build up. So sort of like you're building a pyramid, but you've got to build the bottom first, and then the second layer, then the third layer. You can't do them here and there. You can't jump to engagement without having good governance or good tools, and you can't jump to supporting the community without having participation guidelines. But if we start on the left, the flow is that you start with, do you understand how to use open source within your company or just within you individually? Do you have an understanding of the licenses or the trademarks and how those play? Like, can you use the trademark? Is the license truly open? What does the license allow for? Is it GPL? Is it Apache? Is it Mozilla? Is it even an open source license? Even if the code feels open source, like you can see the code, but is that open source, right? And do you understand OSI and the open source initiative and approved licenses? Then you get to participation guidelines. Do you understand what is allowed from a company basis or from the community's basis where they want participation? So this is two ways here. It's not just can I participate, but where does that community want me to participate? Do I know those guidelines and how to engage? Community understanding. And you jump up. Now, if you've got all of those and you understand how to participate, then you can get involved in contribution, supporting the community, putting out code out there. But in order to do that, you probably need a policy within your company. What are you going to contribute? How in depth are you going to contribute? Do you need any reviews before you contribute? If you're building something for a client, do you need to get the client's approval before you contribute that? Do you need to have a security review before you do that? And even a contribution policy, do you know the level of which you're contributing? So do you know that you're contributing a tiny bit and you're just gonna be like, hey, here's 5 lines of code? Or are you gonna say, no, here's 500 lines of code? And are you aware of, 5 lines of code could only take a week to get through, but 500 lines of code could take you 5 months? Are you aware of that and are you prepared for that? Then finally, we move up in the contribution cycle to governance and how to pull together decision makings, like pull together sort of decisions around things like if you're submitting those 5 lines of code or those 500 lines of code, who approves that? Who accepts it? Or ultimately, who might reject it, right? And then we have other things in there, getting tooling in place and your workflows, which is the whole course we go over, which plays in with governance as well. If you know how your decision making is happening, your leadership, your strategy, your roadmap, and how that's created, are your tools supporting that, or are they hindering it? And there's a good interplay there? And then finally, if you get all of those things, you get sort of like the cherry on top. You get engagement, because with luck, if all of these things are here, and your community understands it, or you understand it with the community that you're engaging with, then you can properly engage and have a successful engagement. And that's the idea of this model, of this representation that I've built over the years, of saying, hey, if we can pull all these things together, then they seem to indicate some level of success here. But failing in one area allows us to focus and say, okay, maybe I'm not having the success I want. Like maybe my feature requests are not getting through, and maybe it's because we're missing parts of these. Maybe you just don't understand how they wanted this thing licensed and where that's going, or maybe you didn't understand the roadmap, or you just weren't collaborating well. And it's a way of thinking through it. So in this course, we're going to talk a little bit about governance models here, and I'm sort of like reading this here. Um, uh, so, and I'll address these ones because I also got it now on my phone. um, so I'm going to talk a little bit about governance models in open source and some of the most common ones that we see. I think some people have heard of this VDFL model, or the benevolent dictator for life, right? Where, let me pull this down here. That VDFL is generally the author of the project. Like in the case of Drupal, that's Dries. You know, when he started the project, he was a college student and he built some software that he thought only he was going to use. And then it turns out lots and lots and lots of people came. But he didn't intend that to be. He didn't set out and say, oh, I'm going to put this code out there, and in 10 years, I'm going to have thousands of developers collaborating with me, and I'm going to sit at the top. They're generally people who just put it out there, and then a community built around them, and everybody looks to their leadership and their guidance. And a lot of projects are this way because the person who created it had a vision. They had a vision of what they were trying to create, or what type of change they were making in the world, and that has uh, put them in this position, into the BDFL position. Others, we use a meritocracy or a liberal contribution model, and there's a number of other ones that are in here on the next slide. But these are sort of the ones that I see in terms of the top three. So meritocracy, which Apache has been using for a long time, you basically sort of like work your way up the ladder, right? You submit ideas over time, a lot of consistency, submit code, and sort of like earn your way into a leadership model, or into a leadership position. And then once in that leadership position, you're the one helping to set the roadmap and the strategy, uh, etc. Right? Node went a different way in this. Node.js has a liberal contribution model. So whereas in the Apache project, their governance is, we're not going to really take your code until you've proven over time that we can trust you, that you've shown the merit, right? That you've put the time and effort in. Whereas Node is like, hey, there's a whole lot of you guys out here, a whole lot of developers out there. We want to hear from everybody, and we're just going to take all of their code, right? And it's not saying that all the code just immediately makes it into the core product, but they take in a lot more. They take in a lot more requests for strategy, for roadmaps. They take in a lot more decisions. They have uh, bigger technical steering committees. They have bigger committees. They're involving more people in this. And it's not to say that either of these is right or wrong, or that one was an older model and this is a newer model. It's just say that this is where culture and the community sort of like come together, which is, you know, if we're going to choose a governance model, it should play along with our culture and vice versa. Right? So I have another one we're going to go over a little bit more here, but I want to address some of these questions because I've seen them over here. But there's one that was back here. So I think this is a good question on here in terms of how we think of uh, that contribution pyramid. And I do want to go back to it because as we go into some more governance models, I think this is important. So the question there is, what happens if we are not fully complete with the building blocks before, a company does not fully have an open source software use policy? Should they move forward to the participation guidelines? So if we're looking at this, and I'm repeating this hopefully for the recording because I'm not sure if it's picking up just my screen share or the chat as well. But if I think what I understand the question is, do we need to do these in this order? And if that's the question, no. Like if you can have a good understanding of the community before you understand their license. Yeah, I think there's some interplay there, but I think you can skip some of these because there are some nuanced licenses. And recently, we've been seeing that licenses have changed. Um, MongoDB is a really good example of this. If you look at the history of that, I mean, it's been changing its license. But does that change its community? It's a question. I don't know if there's a good one there, but I mean, changing the license did not immediately change their community. Um, so I don't see these as in this is the exact order you need to do them, other than bottom to top. You should get the bottom ones done before you move up to the next step I don't think you could have good governance unless you really understand your open source use policy, how you're going to participate, and have a good strong license policy. And we're going to talk about this one here with companies, particularly around governance, because if you don't know how you want to participate with your community, how will you know what you will or will not accept from them in terms of their ideas, their suggestions, etc. Right? So the next question is sort of on that, like this pyramid. Uh, the question is, how often do you think engaged contributors actually do all or most of the stuff that you said, like this chart? I think the engaged people do. I think the engaged people generally have all of these things, minus policies, because policies are typically the company. Um, but if we leave out the word policy, like thinking of just my company, Accenture, I think we have a number of people that are engaged that have been using open source before they were hired before the company, and they just get it. They understand all of these blocks, but they may not have actually understood our policy yet because they just were just hired or they haven't had the time to look at it yet. But they understand how to use. So if we look at it, if you remove the word policy, I think that's pretty common. So moving forward, the governance models in open source here, I see them that they're this mix of these cultural and technical components. And that's why I led this with Excel. I find Accelerate's a good book because it's data driven. Nicole and her team has done an amazing amount of like research. And now she's out over at GitHub, and I'm hoping there's a lot more research that comes out of that. But the data is like showing that culture has a really big impact. And I see that the culture that you cultivate plays into your governance model and vice versa. That a governance model is just like, oh, I'm going to choose this meritocracy. Like you might choose a meritocracy because your culture sort of dictates that this is the way it's going to go. Like Node's culture and community really pushed it towards a liberal contribution model. They didn't choose that out of the gate. That's not how it was built. It's not how Node was created. They built this thing up over time. And if you go Google their liberal contribution uh, policies, it's largely driven from how their community interacted, how quickly they were submitting things, how quickly they could move in that model, and also the level of activity that's in there. Uh, I do think some of it, and I do not recall if they had called this out, but I do think some of it is also there around the diversity and inclusiveness of that community. Whereas I think, and this is nothing bad about the Apache project, but the Apache project has traditionally been um, not, I don't want this to come across as like, the Apache projects have traditionally been not as inclusive because they want you to like prove your technical merit before they bring you into certain roles. So you couldn't often just jump into an Apache project as somebody who's never been seen before and say, here's a bunch of code. You traditionally would just get a ton of uh, comments on it, or you might be ignored. Like, they wanted to show that you were going to be around for a while. Whereas Node was a little bit more inclusive on this other side of, we think you may not be around for the next day. So sure, we'll take your idea right now and great, thank you. And then they don't expect to see you the next day or the next week or the next month. And they've adjusted their community to know that that's going to happen. Whereas Apache has traditionally not adjusted their community for that. And they're like, no, our community is you were here and you're here for a longer period of time. And this is that interplay of community expectations and culture to understand how you want to do that leadership. And I hesitated Alyssa, I hesitated on that word inclusive because it wasn't inclusive in terms of the diversity side of things. It was more on the, I see it in the including people that for the longevity of their time with the project. And there does seem to be a a split in certain communities and projects, as in if you're not going to be here for a while, maybe say let's say 6 months or longer, then we're probably not going to include you in our leadership and our decision making. Whereas other communities like Node have said, that's okay. Maybe you have a great idea and you're only going to be here for a day or two. We'll take the idea, and maybe you're the one who won't actually build it, but we'll take your idea anyways and put it somewhere, and maybe somebody else will build it. Whereas others are like, hey, if you're not going to be the one to build it, great idea, but we don't have the time or energy to execute on everybody's ideas. And this sort of interplay is, I see it playing out in various different open source projects. But I do think there's some issues sort of in this with this meritocracy in terms of building this diversity, building this inclusive model. Yeah. But not saying that you can't get around them. So Lisa, I'm not sure if that addressed your question, but I think it's a very, I think it's a very good question. And I'm going to pick on my own community here, Drupal at the bottom. Because for a long time, Drupal has been a meritocracy, right? We had BDFL, still do. There's a benevolent dictator for life, Dries. He sets the roadmap, he sets strategy, and then he creates maintainers below. And I'll show a whole slide with this depicted here. And the way you would sort of work your way up in the community is a meritocracy. You would submit code, you would need to prove yourself, and you would need to um, put the time and the effort and sort of the sweat equity in. And I don't have a slide for this, and I can get it to you guys afterwards, but Dries actually wrote a really good post on this, and I want to say it was about 2 years ago, where it was pre-COVID because we were all in person. So it was one of those conferences where I actually saw human beings in person. But he addressed this, and he addressed exactly what you said, saying maybe we were wrong in our community about meritocracy, because while that might have found certain leaders, it did not provide opportunities for others. And before this blog post came out and his presentation about it, the community was making strides to have greater inclusivity and to diversify the community and to provide opportunities for people who are either just new to open source, new to development, new to this as a career. It was maybe they were not doing it as a hobby and they didn't have 120 hours a week of their side time to put into it. So we want to diversify into these areas and other sort of diversification groups and strategies to provide those, because you're 100% like spot on. And I'd encourage you to like go Google that, or I'll send you the link. But he's written a pretty good blog post about how meritocracy can, and in the Drupal community, I think you know, uh, did not provide the opportunities for others to really get involved. So, but it's a governance model. It's out there. It's part of what we're working with. And now the question is sort of where do we go from here? Um, Node has done one with the liberal contribution. Um, Knative, and these are just some examples, went through a technical steering committee. Drupal, we still do a core lead, but we do multiple working groups or initiative leads to provide different areas for decision-making, strategy, etc. So we've got a few more, and then I got a few case studies that I want to go over, and then I'd love to sort of open up for chat and have a discussion about this. But I want to talk about a few other governance models that are out there, because there is no like governance model that's going to fit it. I truly do believe what I wrote in that first bullet point there in the last slide, which is this is a mix of your culture and your technical structure. So what you're building and how your community is interacting. So just as a scenario, the Open Compute project is one I looked at. As you can see at the top here, 2009, Facebook started this project, and it was to open source things like the data center facility, like how a server is made, open source some of the way telecommunications. So, some of the technologies behind like 5G and radio frequencies, open source the hardware behind networking devices like switches and routers, etc. And change these so that it's not singularly led by by one company. And why I find this one interesting is this is all the same project. This is Open Compute. You can Google it. They have a whole website. These are all led by the same group. So it's predominantly Facebook led. They have, you can see here, representatives and leads from different other companies. But what I want you to notice in each one of these verticals, they have different governance models. So in the networking sort of vertical, their governance model is very unstructured. It's very liberal. It's effectively like if you show up to a meeting, you are now in a leadership position. Like you don't have to be appointed. You just need to show up. Then on the telecommunications, they actually have an election process. So it's very structured. You got to be active. You got to go through an election. You got to be like, put in a position of leadership. And the data center one went back to just whatever. If you show up to the meeting, you're part of it. And this is what Node went with Node.js. Like their liberal contribution policy was effectively that. Like, if you're here and we can hear you, you're now part of the decision making. That was it, right? So even the same, the takeaway from here is even the same sort of companies or the same group that started this still ended up with different governance models. They didn't just copy and paste and said, this is our governance structure. It's going to work in all these places. It's a different model for different groups. And most likely, if you look at these things, it's really based upon who's participating and how that interacts with their own sort of like cultures within those companies and how they want to interact. OpenEuler is another one from Huawei. They open sourced a CentOS based operating system, sort of as a, I think as a competitor to Android. Maybe they don't see it that way, but still, it's an operating system that works on handheld mobile devices, handheld devices, and other devices. And their governance structure is very based upon meritocracy, and it's very structured, right? So they choose the maintainers. The maintainers have to come in and demonstrate. It is open, so they meet openly. And if you're basically involved long enough, then they will come and they will ask you. Um, they are um, pretty rigid in this, and they say they're pretty rigid because it's an operating system that's used on handheld devices and mobile devices, and they have to go through sort of rigid security design and rigid sort of testing and review processes to get everything in, and they want those people who are going to be in leadership positions to take that seriously. So they went with the meritocracy, whereas the Facebook Open Compute has literally unstructured governance models. You're like, show up. um, and they bring in those decision makings. So the last one here, and I'll go over, and I have plenty more, but I do want to provide time for us to chat about this. This is the Drupal model, just sort of visually represented. There's the core lead at the top here. That's Dries. He's setting strategy and roadmap, but he doesn't do it alone, and I don't think he's done it as a singular individual for at least 10 years, if not longer, if ever, to be honest. There's always been maintainers or initiative leads within the project. Each major version going back many, like at least 10 years, each major version had a lead. So it was the BDFL Dries, and then a lead over that version. And that lead over the version also had strategy, roadmap, and then they would then appoint other individuals to lead initiatives. So it might be like the initiative to enhance the UI, or enhance the server experience, or to enhance the performance, or to enhance comment modules or database handling, something, whatever that initiative was for that version. So there would be another like 10 or so people in the leadership. So it was never a singular person. And I don't want you to walk away that a BDFL has got to take care of everything. They rarely do. The BDFL generally appoints people or grabs people and pulls them in. And those are the people helping to review code, push that code, publish it, clean it up, funnel the ideas, look at sort of the technical merit of those ideas, and make sure that they match the overall roadmap, or if the roadmap should be switched or changed, etc. But the final commit to get that code, which would contain the bug fix or the feature enhancement, does rely on those leads. Whether they're the maintainer or the BDFL, they're generally the only ones who actually have access to submit code to the main branches. And that's where we start to see some differences in our governance model. Is at some point, who actually puts, pen to paper, so to speak, or who commits that code into the main branch. And so this is the Drupal model here. I get that word out. All right, I'm going to pause here, and if there's any questions or open up for sort of a chat here. And you can see I have other examples. I can go on about this for like hours, so I'm pausing to let's have a conversation about what you guys are seeing out there.
Sorry. Hi, Jacob. That was super interesting. Yeah, and there are like a couple words that are like trigger words for me for whatever reason. One is governance. As somebody's like, we should establish a governance model, and you're like, no, but because it's hard. I'm wondering. So that was good, and I'm wondering, like, for this course specifically, will we be kind of, I don't know, how will we be extending like what you kind of covered here?
Extending on this?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a good question. Like, what a great segue. So in the workflows and infrastructure course, what we focus on is infrastructure. So what tooling do we need in place? What repository, issue queue management, bug security enhancements, disaster recovery, decision-making systems, etc. That's our primary focus on that. And then that has an interplay with governance. So if you think of how you do your leadership models, how that might play into your tooling, like how you manage, like where do you put your code repositories? Do you use GitLab, GitHub? Like Drupal.org as an example, we moved to Git years ago, and we recently moved to GitLab. But one of the reasons we haven't just made a wholesale jump to say something like GitHub is because of our governance models and the way the community works. Because while the main project has one lead and then maintainers, there's like tens of thousands of individual projects that all have their own leads that have nothing to do with the core. Because there's core Drupal, and then there's all these modules and extensions, and they have their own models. And we wanted tools that allowed all these people to have independence without relying upon one single person. And GitHub and GitLab just didn't really allow that at that time, without creating literal tens of thousands of projects and making it super messy. So that's in the course what we talk about is I've done some interviews and brought some other people into the course. That's what we talk about, is how do we make those decisions, and building a checklist of what we want to build, why we want to build it, how does it interplay, when might it hinder me, when might it help me. We get deep. Those are the things we
Yeah.
get deeper into.
And follow up on that. Are we coming from the perspective of a company that open sources their code and wants to build a community, or or I suppose, and I'm sure there's others, but or a community that is looking to build, I guess, is an infrastructure that's accessible for a lot of different types of stakeholders? Where's
Um,
the perspective starting from?
can you say the last one one more time? The
Are we talking about,
yeah.
again, like a company that's open sourcing their code and they want to create a community, or like a community that exists? Like I come
Mm,
from the OpenStreetMap community. That was not, that did not start from a company
mhm,
background, right? But we've had to make changes so that it's accessible for lots of different types of stakeholders, whether that's like companies or governments, or different types of
mhm.
individuals. Actually, maybe they want to do historical mapping. So so I'm wondering, are we going to be starting from one perspective and kind of running through the course from like the company perspective, or we'll be like moving around? If you could speak a little bit about, the infrastructure for what type of open source community.
Yeah. So it's a really good question that I've struggled with
Mm.
because I now have both hats. My a good chunk was 100% in the open source world, right? Drupal, as well as like NTP, and even early days of Linux Foundation when I was getting involved. Like when I was getting involved with Drupal, I was an IT director of a organization here in New York, and Drupal was like my side project. It was my hobby, and I did that for years. And I did other things as a professional career that were not Drupal, but I was helping to grow the Drupal project, even though it wasn't my full-time job. And so I have that perspective of when we were building Drupal, it was not company led. In fact, we started the foundation just around after companies started to be founded to be focused on Drupal. But they were founded to focus on Drupal after Drupal was starting to establish itself as you could create a company on top of this. Um, and part of the reason we decided to create a foundation was to help create stability for those companies. So it was 100% a community-led project, and we made sure everything was always community owned, always community driven, and always had the community support. And now my focus professionally is on the complete opposite side, is where I'm helping companies create open source projects. And so there are, these are like gainfully employed individuals. Maybe they've been at the company for 10 years and now they're starting an open source project, which is a completely different perspective. So to answer your question, I'm trying to mix in both. Um, I don't know where that mix will be. I think I'm going to let it play out and who signs up for the course and who's there. Because I've struggled with it. I'm like, should I speak from the enterprise side? Because that's where my current focus is, like day to day, or should I really bring in my Drupal side, which is very community, non-corporate? And there's going to be a play there. It's going to come from both sides, and I haven't figured out the equilibrium. Is it 60-40, 70-30? Come join me. Let's figure it out.